Walter, for that very kind introduction. Okay, what I'm doing here is really a kind of a new project, which means that it's only getting started, which means a couple of things. In a certain sense, it means I have too little to say because I'm only starting and these are all stuff that I haven't really worked out yet, and usually that means what I have to say is much dumber and less interesting than what I get if I spend a long time working on it. On the other hand, it's too much because I'm talking about 3 movies here as part of a project what might ultimately be more films, but I'd probably talk about each one for an hour. So I'll try to streamline things as much as possible and just give a kind of outline, which is basically all I have anyway at this point. Okay, the talk, I guess it comes out of two areas. One is, it's a kind of, in a way, it's a loose sequel to my new book, which is coming out in the first half of December, which is called Post-Cinematic Affect, and which deals with several recent contemporary or near recent American, British, and Western European films and music videos, and makes a general argument both about the transition to digital media and about the political and social climate in which films and other media are expressing today. This project doesn't really talk about the new media aspect, but it tries to look at Eastern European films as a counterweight to my discussion of North American and Western films. So it's sort of why I'm calling it some subtitles, some revisionary thoughts on Eastern European film. I'm not an expert in Eastern European film. One root of this class is I taught a 5,000 level class on Eastern European film from 1955 to the present about 3.5 years ago. Actually, this winter term was 4 years ago. And it was a very successful class, but I taught it largely because I wanted to teach myself more about Eastern European film. And I think however it succeeded with the students, it succeeded in that for me. I did learn more about it. I still feel that I'm an outsider, and I don't feel confident writing about these films in the same ways that I would feel writing about American film or Canadian or other English language film or even Western European like French film, because I just don't know the languages, I don't know the cultures very much. However, I kind of think of that as being itself part of my project in the sense that what interests me about the Eastern European films, and obviously it's not a general statement, it can't be said about every Eastern European film, but about the Eastern European films which I'm trying to look at is precisely that they come from a different perspective, one which would be hard for us to imagine living here or in the United States in 2010. And I'll summarize what that is in a moment. But for now, here are the 3 films which I'm talking about. They're 2 very recent films, one from Hungary and one from Serbia. And in between them, I'm talking about a much older Yugoslavian film, which provide the image which you saw at the beginning, which I'll come back to that image. So these 3 films all have very different agendas, and they're made in very different climates. The W.R. Mysteries Organism is a very canonized film, and lots has been written about it. Taxidermy and Life and Death of the Porno Gang are relatively new films with relatively little written about them thus far. The connection between them, aside from a kind of geographical location and a kind of experience of a common history of communism and socialism, is also, these are all very kind of extreme body films. They explicitly portray sex violence and extreme visceral states. They all also use this to provide allegories of social, political, and economic forms of life, and using forms of life in a very general way. But just to say that they're more allegorical. They're all more allegorical than directly representational. They're all concerned with the politics and economics of socialism and/or capitalism, but in that way they're concerned with it from the point of view of affect, or the affective implications of politics and economics. In other words, they're really affective films. They're films about not about how certain political, social, and economic structures function objectively, but about how they feel to and affect the people who are participating in or who are ensnared in such societies. Ultimately, all these 3 I have articles in progress which have been commissioned for various places. Hopefully, if it ever becomes a book, there would probably be discussion of a few more films. Okay. Now, I said that I'm really just looking at Eastern European films from the outside, and I'm arbitrarily limiting. When I say Eastern European, the class I taught 4 years ago dealt with films from Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia and its successor states, Romania and Yugoslavia and its successor states. And that's kind of arbitrary delimitation, but I wanted to leave out the former Soviet Union on one hand, which I didn't feel I could deal with, and leave out East Germany on the other hand because of its ties to German culture and now unified Germany had a whole different range of problems than these other countries pose. I left out Bulgaria and Albania largely because I don't know any films from them. There are very few films which are subtitled and available, and I don't know enough about their film industries either. Romania also actually only talked about post-1989 because it's hard to find much from the war. But anyway, obviously 1989, the end of communism in Eastern Europe and the fall of the Berlin Wall is a central reference point for what I'm doing. And the most obvious way to divide these films is to talk about pre- and post-1989, because obviously everything about them is different, from the economic conditions of production to the kinds of things expressed. But my feeling when I said that these films seemed different to me, and I felt outside in relation to my, I felt this isn't my culture, this isn't my history, and I can't really relate to them directly, and that's precisely what interests me about them. So it comes across in several ways. One way is that pre-1989 films, and again, I'm not making a statement about all films made in these countries. I'm talking about mostly about art films and films which are available in the West, and particular ones which I find particularly interesting. So this is not a universal statement, but a lot of interesting pre-1989 films in these countries tend to have a very interesting perspective, because on the one hand, they are works of political dissent, and they're critiques of actually existing socialism, of the conditions under which people were compelled to live. However, at the same time, if you try to work out what is the point of their critiques, they're criticizing the horrific things which went on in these societies. From what point of view are they criticizing them? They're not criticizing them from a point of view that's recognizably ours, say North American, Western, capitalist point of view. It's hard to reconstruct, but they seem to want something else. What they want is change in their societies. Of course, this has to be expressed indirectly through censorship, but they're not asking to become a Western society. They seem to be asking for something else. And there's a kind of mirror of this in post-1989. What happens is that people in this country, were ecstatic about being liberated from these oppressive regimes, but what they got wasn't exactly what they bargained for, and sort of being completely segued into existing world capitalism turned out to be a nasty surprise for a lot of people. When they lost their jobs, they lost their Social Security net, and various other kinds of things happened. So the result of this is that the most interesting post-1988 films, sometimes they have more specific references, like the Balkan Wars of the 90s, make a mark on both films from all the ex-Yugoslav countries and from surrounding countries like Romania. But what seems to me to happen in the most interesting of these post-1989 films is that they don't see capitalism as being naturalized in the way we can't help seeing it as being naturalized. In a certain sense, they portray, before 1989, they portrayed the socialist regimes they lived under as being these very kind of bizarre, arbitrary kind of impositions. And now they portray capitalism as also being a bizarre, arbitrary imposition, which is because it was only kind of implanted in the last 20, 25 years. And so it's a perspective that we can't have on the same kind of social problems, the social system. So both before and after 89, there seem to be interesting divergences in point of view. So I'm trying to suggest that the films diverge from what we might expect to be familiar with in the West, and that also my position from being outside and not having access to the perspectives of the filmmakers and their original communities also gives me a kind of skewed perspective to reconstruct certain things going on in these films. Okay, so this is, I should have put this slide earlier, sorry. Anyway, so this is basically what I'm saying about films before and after 1989. We have this disappointment with, after 1989, we have this disappointment with the transition to capitalism, and with a sense that capitalism doesn't seem given and natural in the way it does necessarily to us. Okay, one of the main influences, at least from a present point, is what Mark Fisher calls capitalist realism. I take this book to be the most important work of cultural studies of the last decade or so, and it seems to be the closest I can think of as a definitive description of what seems to me to be the major socio-cultural predicament we face now. And the predicament is, Fisher says, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. He's echoing, that's a kind of